Hey Drew, good morning from me and good evening to you. How you doing?
Doing very well. Great to see you, Atif. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. It's been a while, but I've been watching you do some great stuff, and that's why I'm really keen to get you on here and have a quick discussion. So for everybody, I mean, I've known Drew for quite some time. We used to work in the same company together, and I think we're united by our passion in our focus on helping Africa grow, prosper, and doing that through a sort of energy perspective. So that's kind of what has brought us together. But Drew, it's been a while, so over to you. It would be really good just to give us a refresher, background, what you're up to, and then we'll take it from there.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Atif, for putting this together. It's great to reconnect and to be able to share a little of what I'm doing and learn more about what you're up to as well. So I am calling in today from Portland, Oregon, up in the northwest of the U.S. I am originally from New York, but I lived and worked in the Caribbean for a long time, first in Panama and then in Haiti. That was where I first started getting into energy access. I ran a utility company in Haiti that was a private utility, had a concession from the Haitian government to provide energy to a pretty big area, about 200,000 people. And we were building power plants from scratch. The generation, distribution, even the metering, we came up with and installed in the houses there. And that was really my first foray into energy access and to learn what it's like of the folks that live off the grid and how difficult that can be and how key the access to electricity is to unlock a lot of the potential of the region. So I came back from Haiti to the US in 2019, and I joined DNV with their energy storage engineering team. So this is mostly battery focused team. We were working on large scale energy storage projects. So usually 20 megawatts and up, some all the way up to 400 or 500 megawatt battery projects as that industry grew. But within that team, I founded and led the energy access team at DNV. And that team was focused on mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, but in several other parts of the world as well, either extending existing grids to provide energy access to folks that do not have access to grids, or even financing and building new grids in places that never had access to electricity. So it was a really interesting role. I had a great opportunity to build up a team who could work on those types of projects and really start a new thing at DNV, which was really exciting, have the backing of the company and got to work on some excellent projects there. I left DNV back in February to join PowerSwitch. PowerSwitch is a energy storage advisory firm, also working in energy access. So we're split. Probably 75% of the work we do is focused on energy storage projects, some in the U.S., but really all over the world as that industry has boomed. But also the remainder of our work is focused on supporting energy access in any different way. We're consultants, so we advise project developers, owners, off-takers. We also do a lot of training and education around energy access and inspiring the sort of next generation of folks that want to work in that industry.
Fantastic. And no, thanks for that, Drew. And although we'll sort of focus on Africa today, it's really good that you mentioned there are many regions around the world, many um, uh, smaller areas, island nations, and things like that kind of benefit from the approach you're taking and what you're doing. So drilling down a bit deeper, then I think as we're focusing on Africa, I always read this statistic. I'm not sure. I've even forgotten now the reference, but um, we always have a statistic that around 600 million people still lack access to, um, for now, let's call it modern forms of energy or grid connected energy, where you have your home and you just plug things in the socket and everything works sort of fantastic. Um, I recently read in a report also that we're expecting the population of Africa to grow from around, I think, say 1.2 billion or something like that now, up to 2050, perhaps closer to 2 billion. That's another stat that I read recently. I think, just to give credit, that was in a McKinsey quarterly report. I can double check that for all viewers. If I've got it wrong, just give me a message. I apologize, but those are the sort of things that we see. So immense growth and the current situation. From your experience, can you just give us your perspective on Africa and what you've seen? Perhaps the situation you've seen with regards to the way energy is used, and also perhaps you can elaborate further on what we mean by energy access, and we can take it forward from there.
Sure. So maybe let's start with that figure that you cited, the around 600 million people. Generally, that is tracked by the World Bank, and they have a number of ways they put that together. It is somewhat difficult to get data on some of the regions and areas, but that's their best guess. And to be clear, that is people who are not connected to any grid.
Right.
It does not include many people who have access to a grid, but maybe the power goes out every couple of days, or in some places every day you have outages. They are counted as having electricity access. And so I think in addition to the 600 million, there's at least that many, and probably more, that have intermittent access to a grid, or much less service that we might be used to, say, in the US or in Dubai. So I think it's a really, really big issue. And again, as you said, it's around the world. But the vast majority of those 600 million are located in sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay.
And firstly, I think I'd like to point out that energy access, or access to a reliable grid, is just the foundation for modern life and for economic development. I mean, you really cannot start a business or even have light for the kids to do homework or communicate without electricity.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these places, people do have cell phones, and they're using energy in one way or the other. It might be gasoline they put into their motorcycles. It might be candles or kerosene they buy to light. It might be a local bodega where they have a solar panel or a small generator to charge cell phones. But in many of these places, they may charge, say, 25 US cents to charge your phone. So, it's not much money, but if you think about it on a kilowatt hour basis, some places are paying over $10 a kilowatt hour. So there's just, it's really unbelievable that people that really have very few economic resources end up paying sometimes up to 100 times more what we pay in the developed world for the same energy. So it's a huge issue. It's across the continent. I mean, I think there's some countries and regions that have much stronger and better access to electricity, but others that are really in the dark, literally, in many parts of the country.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I remember once I traveled to a number of countries, but the one that I really remember is Malawi. And I traveled to a region called Salima. I stayed there for some time, and then sort of ventured out at night. And I mean, when you coin the term pitch black or pitch dark, I mean, literally, it's pitch dark, and you are using the moonlight to walk around. And people are cooking, and there are lanterns and kerosene lamps and things like that. So yeah, I can really kind of empathize with that. So now you've set the scene in terms of your view of Africa and the challenges there. We've also got the challenge that we're looking to kind of reach a more sustainable future, and a lot of countries around the world are focusing on net zero targets. But putting net zero to the side and everything else. I think in terms of improving energy access and green energy, what are your views on that, and the sort of technology choices you see in moving forwards?
Sure. Well, maybe to first define some of the terms. So energy access, when we started the team at DNV, that was the first thing we had to do and decide what is energy access? What do we want to focus on? And I think the best definition really stems from the Sustainable Development Goals,
Okay.
which of course are targets in many different aspects of development that the world is targeting for 2030. Sustainable Development Goal 7 is that we'd like to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for everyone in the world.
Yeah.
So affordable, it has to be at a price folks can afford, not the $10 a kilowatt hour I was mentioning.
Mm-hmm.
Reliable, it cannot be coming and going every day. Sustainable, so there is a strong push to make those sources of energy more carbon neutral or carbon negative in some cases. Also, sustainable means that it can keep going, meaning that it's not an investment where it's sort of donation based and isn't going to just run out of money and the grid will fall apart, as unfortunately has happened in many cases. And lastly, modern, that there are some efforts out there to provide very small solar panels with, let's say, DC energy or power, which it's definitely better than nothing. But I think when you say modern energy, we'd like to have homes with sockets where you can plug in modern appliances. That is really the goal of electrification. So that's what we mean when we say energy access. And like I said, it deals with both the people that do not have any access to the grid and the folks that do have access to the grid, but it's either not reliable or it's very carbon heavy. Unfortunately, there's a lot of power plants, and this would go for both centralized power plants and off grid, of which there's quite a few that are very diesel dependent, heavy fuel oil dependent. There's even a number of cities and countries that run on maritime engines, so floating ships with power that comes in, and unfortunately, it's not very clean power, or it's really not very efficient. By using other forms of power, you can make it more efficient, both from an economic sense and from an energy sense. So all these I think are part of the challenge in electrifying the continent of Africa. I do want to say that there's kind of a big split between urban versus rural parts of the continent. And of course, it's hard to generalize about anything of Africa. It's a massive region. It includes many different languages, religions, you name it, different types of geographies and histories. However, I think that rural-urban divide is really important because you have a number of growing cities across the continent that have become hubs. You look at places in Nigeria that are becoming really massive metropolises, and East Africa, West Africa, even down in South Africa, really growing cities. But there's a pretty big portion of the population that lives in small villages. So these are spread out, millions and millions of people, and sometimes grouped as small as 200 or 300 folks living together in these villages. And then there's everything in between of medium-sized cities. So it's a pretty different challenge. And of course, the goal is to electrify everyone. That we want to have that type of electrical service, both for everyone living in cities that has its own challenges, and the people living in the countryside.
Okay, and I think that's a really, the way you sort of provided that demarcation is really good, because the African continent is a really big place, and the societies, to a certain extent, I guess I can't say fully agrarian, but maybe slightly more traditional, where there are sort of bigger families and communities spread out in multiple villages, as you said. But we have two dynamics here now. It's very interesting. So yeah, you homed in on the cities, and the forecasts are that in the next decades that Africa will contain some of the most populated cities in the world. And I guess with Nigeria, there's Lagos, there's Abuja, and cities like that, and other cities, there's Cairo and perhaps Nairobi and other places that will be growing fast. But at the same time, I think you hinted that, or perhaps I took that, even though there will be some shift of rural to urban population, invariably there will still be a significant rural population in place. So in terms of technology choice, I mean, we know the standard model where you have centralized power and a high voltage grid, and then medium, low voltage, etc. But there are other solutions as well. Everything from, I hope you go into this shortly, everything from micro/mini grids type systems for specific communities, but also standalone, either commercial based or domestic based self-generation and systems as well. How do you see it being rolled out, and what sort of mix? And is it what differences do you see between powering the cities and powering the rural communities?
Sure. So first of all, to start off with a fun statistic I heard recently that really made me think is that at current rates, they project that in about 2100, there'll be more Nigerians than Chinese on the planet. That really made me think, just to give you an idea of how quickly the population is growing.
And they have like about 100 languages. So which one is it? Hausa. We all need to start learning Hausa.
Well, so I think one thing that's important to point out is that while Africa does have a very fast growing population, and over a billion people, which is I think already 15 or 16% of the global population, the numbers of megawatt hours per capita, or kilowatt hours per capita, is very low. So that's a function of a number of things. Of course, the people that don't have any electricity are not contributing to that because they aren't consuming that. But even those who do have access to electricity, the economic movement in many places is just much lower. We refer it in the energy access world as vibrancy. How vibrant is a community, and that would go for cities that are obviously bustling, but even villages. I've visited some villages that have a population of say 1,000 homes, and some are in the desert and very little economic activity. Others are say fishing ports where there's a lot of money coming in and out and business happening. So that vibrancy factor is really important. Right. And I think not only will the continent grow in population, but it's growing in vibrancy, and it's growing in, if you look at that, megawatt hours per person per year, or kilowatt hours. You'll see that continue to grow, and I think it's expected that will even outstrip the population. So populations will grow, and the rate at which they're using energy or electricity will go up quite a bit. So, in terms of solutions of how do we make sure that they have this key ingredient to development, I think it really, by definition, has to be an approach that's tailored to each individual region and each individual country. Installing grids in Lesotho is going to be very different than installing them in Tanzania. Is going to be very different than Cote d'Ivoire. So it really needs a separate approach. And I think the World Bank type approach has been to try to identify a least cost electrification. So electrification projects are very capital intensive. You have to be building power plants. You have to be putting poles in the ground, running wires. These things are not cheap. These things are not easy to do. There's a lot of geographical hurdles. Having these, I've visited rural Zambia, and you drive for 2-3 hours between one village and the next. So, to think about the challenge of running medium voltage or high voltage lines, especially when the consumption is pretty low in certain areas, it presents its own set of challenges. So in those studies to kind of look at least cost electrification, I think the kind of low hanging fruit is cities. Of course, if we can electrify cities better, extend lines even within cities. There's a lot of places either where the outskirts of the city has grown, but the power grid has not grown to meet them. So extending existing grids is one of the easiest ways to connect new people to the grid. Unfortunately, many of the grids are really overtaxed and are underinvested in. So adding new customers sometimes is something that they aren't that excited to do, because it's going to be more load on the grid, more load to serve. I read a statistic at one point, I believe it was somewhere over 50% of grids across the country of Africa, or the continent of Africa, are insolvent. That they have some sort of less, a lot of difficulty selling the power. A lot of countries have the utility company is part of the government. So it's a very political influenced entity. It can be sort of very sluggish to kind of really update with new technology and new investment. And so, I think that's the easiest way, numbers wise, to connect is extending those urban grids, but also modernizing those grids, expanding those grids. Running a utility can be a profitable prospect in the United States and many other places. We have investor-owned utilities that make quite a bit of money. It's usually regulated, but they can be very, very profitable ventures. You're selling something that absolutely everyone needs. You're selling something that once they're connected, very, very few people are going to say, no, thanks, I don't want electricity. You sort of get hooked on it. And you're selling something that usually is monopoly control. So, you can't have 5 power companies, you would have 1. And so all those things contribute to be, if they can crack this nut, it can be a very profitable enterprise, as well as being that key ingredient that's going to assist in development. So, in those least cost electrification plans, we have to look at all those things. The, urban, what they call peri-urban, those, outside of cities. And then the rural challenge, as we mentioned, really is a difficult one. But the solution that has really arisen, even in the past 5 or 6 years, has grown tremendously, is mini grids. Okay. And a mini grid, again, to come back to definitions, a mini grid is a type of microgrid. So microgrid being any type of a part of the grid that can disconnect and can become its own entity, say a hospital, okay, or an army base, or something that has its need to go, either a diesel generator, batteries, solar. That's a microgrid. A type of microgrid is a mini grid when they have their own distribution lines, and are generally an off-grid system. Although recently there's been some grid-connected mini grids. But they are typically remote villages. They have their own production, whether it's diesel, solar, battery, a combination of all those, even wind, and then its own distribution. Usually low voltage. There are some cases where they've started to do medium voltage, but most of them are on low voltage lines, 240 volts or whatever the local voltage is, sending them out. And then the metering is almost always prepaid. So you're paying in advance for the energy the same way you would for your cell phone bill in most of these places. So just to summarize, you have the urban solutions, the peri-urban, or kind of mid-range solutions, and then these rural solutions, which are really dominated by the mini grid technology.
Right. And earlier on, I think you mentioned a statistic that in some places you noticed that, was it for cell phone charging or whatever, that customers effectively were willing to pay up to $10 per kilowatt hour. Was that right?
That's right. And many of these places, they don't have another option. So right. It's not that they.
Sorry, go ahead.
It's not that they would like to, but I think it speaks more to the fact that using a cell phone or having candles to read in the evening, these things are just so critical that people are forced really to pay that much, and they choose to do it. Right. Even with the meager resources that they have in many cases.
Absolutely. Which means that the willingness to pay is there. The willingness to bringing something that's more efficient, more cost effective, affordable, and better, better access, better reliability even. There seems to be a significant producer surplus, if we use the economics terms, to be had, anywhere between kind of acceptable rate and that very high figure is a benefit to both consumers and the producers.
Absolutely. And I think it needs to be seen that way. It has to be seen not as, say, a handout from the government or a public benefit. And that's to make it sustainable. There's too many grids all across the African continent. Everything from hospitals that have been electrified and had a big ribbon cutting ceremony to entire towns I visited in Guinea-Bissau, a town where they had invested, I think it was like $5 or $6 million on an island to install a new generator and run the lines.
Right.
And I was there 5 years after that had happened, and it wasn't running at all.
Okay.
Everything had kind of rusted and fall apart. So that back to that sustainable term, not just sustainable in terms of the environmental impact, but sustainable financially, so that it could be either a government or a third-party entity. They have to run these power plants in a way that makes sense for everyone, like you said. For the customers, it has to be a good value proposition, and from the investors, it has to have that good return, or at least have ways that they can finance it that are going to be profitable.
Okay, great. So Drew, I've got a double question for you. It's just so I don't forget to ask one of them. So the first one is energy storage. We've talked about a number of things, and there's a big focus everywhere at the moment, even for modern grids, about integrating energy storage or using energy storage. There are many types of energy storage, but specifically lithium-ion type batteries, whether it's to support the grid or whatever. From an energy access perspective, can you give us your take on energy storage, batteries as part of an overall solution? And then maybe that can lead into a discussion about all the challenges we see. We've talked about access, we've talked about affordability, we've talked about sustainable development goals, we've talked about population growth, urbanization versus rural communities. And so it would be great to finish off with how PowerSwitch is involved in helping to plug, pun intended, plug those gaps. So it's a double question: energy storage, and then if we can move into how are you helping to make all of this a reality? Yeah, the energy access.
Absolutely. So to the first part of the question about how energy storage plays a role in energy access. So when I first started the energy access team at DNV, I recall that many people were scratching their heads saying, "That's great, but why are you on the battery team, doing this?"
Right.
And I think the reason is that almost every energy access project that I've been involved with has some kind of energy storage. The technology has evolved so much that the same economics that are driving these massive, hundreds or thousands of megawatt hour projects that we're starting to see all over the world, that those same economics make a lot of sense for a mini grid that might have 12 kilowatts of generation, as much as they do for a large plant that might have 300 or 400 megawatts connected to the grid. And I think one of the main roles is in supporting solar. The vast majority of mini grids, they want to use the solar resource. A lot of places in Africa have great solar resource. Have like really, really good numbers of kilowatt hours per kilowatt of energy that you get out installing solar. But of course, the sun does not shine in the evening. And so in order to make sure that you want to have as little fossil fuel dependence as possible, in some cases zero, but in most cases it's kind of keep it as low as you can.
Yeah.
And you achieve that by having the lowest cost storage. Today, the lowest cost storage is lithium-ion batteries. So almost every mini grid company in one way or the other has batteries. There are some maybe that are still using some lead acid, but in the long term, lithium-ion has come way down in price and has become the much better investment choice. That brings its own set of challenges. There's some really remote, rugged environments we're talking about here. There are places where if something breaks, you may have to get on a motorbike and go a couple hours to maintain it. So it's an additional challenge of not just financing, building, operating the technology, but making sure that it's really robust and rugged in a way that'll work for these environments. So to the question, almost every energy access project that I've worked on has lithium-ion batteries in one way or the other. And I think as time goes by and the prices of those come down, the supply of them come up, even the engineering expertise or the O&M expertise evolves, we're just going to continue to see that. As a lead into the next part of my question, a lot of any energy project involves finance. As I mentioned before, these projects are very expensive to build. In most cases, at least the projects that everyone at DNV was working on were really pretty large scale projects. These many megawatt battery plants, solar, wind, gas, whatever it was, it sort of had to be at scale. You're going to invest a certain amount and you're going to make money off of that investment over the course of 20 years, 30 years, however long the life of the project is. Similarly, any mini grid or energy access project has to go through the same process. It has to make sure that they can be financed, that they have good prospects to make back that money and pay back the equity investors and the lenders on that project. And historically, in I know the United States and many other parts of the world, that was done by having very low cost debt. Almost 100 years ago, back in the 1920s and 30s in the US, there was kind of innovations in saying we need to electrify rural parts of America. How do we do that? And it really was the federal government saying, okay, here's some money, you can pay it back over 50 years, because otherwise it's a very difficult prospect. You don't have the money coming in the way you might with, say, a massive battery project or gas plant where you just know you're going to get paid a certain amount per year. Yeah. So I think the challenge of financing these, both with the limited amount of revenue that they could produce, the high level of capital, and to be frank, the high level of risk. To building a mini grid way off of in the middle of nowhere in Kenya, or let's say a portfolio of 30 sites scattered around the country, there's just a lot more risk there than there is building a centralized plant, even in a country like Kenya that has some of the more sophisticated utilities relative to other parts of Africa. So to the second part of your question about what PowerSwitch does, a lot of what we do is related to unlocking that finance. And that would go for both energy storage projects or from energy access projects. We kind of split our work into two parts, really three parts. The first is owner's engineering. So that would be on behalf of the project developer, whether they're building a 200 megawatt battery in Ontario, Canada, where there's a big procurement actually going on right now, or whether it's a company that's putting a portfolio of those mini grids together, say in Zambia, and looking to get it financed. We help them design their project in a way that when they get to that financing stage, they've limited some of the risk. Right. That can be done by making sure you have strong agreements in place, good technology in place. Your financial model isn't too optimistic. That's been a big sticking point with mini grids recently, of how much energy consumption you can assume. And all these things to get a project to a point where it is bankable, meaning that when it becomes to be financed, the lenders or the equity investors feel comfortable with the risk. There's always going to be some risk, but you want to make sure that risk is managed, mitigated, and quantified. So that's one side of the work we do, is helping those owners with their technical needs. The other side is independent engineering. So as with a lot of the work at DNV, when either lenders or equity investors come in, it's frequent that they want to hire a technical advisor to understand those risks. Again, the same of whether it's the mini grid portfolio or whether it's an energy storage project. So we'll help them do a due diligence process, looking at all the potential risks, from technology to the financial model to looking at the interconnection that you may have with the utility. There's a unique risk to some of the energy access projects in that you have to worry about currency risk. Some of the currencies are very, very unstable, so something you have to think of. And then also, unfortunately, there's a risk of potential nationalization. We saw in Tanzania, that was one of the really big markets where there was a lot of investment. That investment has really pulled back a lot because the government has kind of muscled in, and in some cases said you have to charge a lower tariff, or things like that. So that's the other side of our work. We do owner's engineering on behalf of the projects, independent engineering on behalf of the finance. And lastly, we've started doing quite a few trainings, anyone from developers to governments to law firms that want to learn about energy storage or energy access. And we provide a variety of different curriculum that will help educate them in that regard.
Excellent. That was a really, I know I threw a double-barreled question at you, and that was really good answer. Drew, I think I'll kind of perhaps leave it there. There's a lot more we can discuss. I think we should do this again, maybe 3 to 6 months or something, and see how things are progressing, especially after COP28, where there has been a big focus on establishing, a climate finance fund, whatever they want to call it. But the idea is to create a bigger pool of finance to help regions like Africa and others transition, modernize their energy systems and give them access to funds, especially where they're looking at clean solutions with combinations of solar and storage and whatever. So, yeah, perhaps after that, all the dust settles there, and we see some new initiatives, we could get a temperature check from yourself on the market.
I love that. I think one of the things I really like about these sort of dual fields we're working in, energy storage and energy access, things are changing very fast.
Yeah.
It seems like every month there's either a new technology, a new project announced. Just a quick summary, this past week, there was a project I worked on at DNV, a 40 megawatt, 4-hour battery. They signed the first offtake agreement in Senegal. It's a massive project relative to the size of the grid. So really exciting. It was Lakela started. I think they're part of Infinity now, which is associated with Masdar, and so that was a really huge step forward. There was another, was Cross Boundary, who's an investor in mini grid projects. They announced a open source project finance model, so you can download the Excel of what normally is very guarded, this financial model about mini grids. They open source that for others to learn from it. So just two really exciting steps, and constantly things are changing. It's a really great field to be in. When I talk to young people, I really encourage them to get into both of these, because it's just a great place to be, both from a career perspective and it's satisfying work. So I would love to have part 2 at some point.
Fantastic. All right. Okay. Look, I know it's late for you. Thanks for joining. Really appreciate it. And I think it's time for breakfast for me. So we'll catch up with each other soon. Cheers, Drew.
Thank you. Thanks, Atif. Yeah, my pleasure.